Hi there, I'm Jubobs with a zero, not an O, on Twitter and elsewhere. And today I'd like to talk to you about subdomain takeover. What is a subdomain takeover? It's a vulnerability that allows an attacker to control some or all of the content served by a subdomain. So on the right there, you see an example of a subdomain takeover. A couple of months back, I was able to take control of that subdomain of xbox.com and to prove to Microsoft that the vulnerability was there. I took the liberty to install a harmless voting app on that subdomain. So why is that an interesting vulnerability? Well, first of all, it's very widespread. Okay, it's the type of vulnerability that's definitely benefited from the rise of the cloud. That said, it's not very well known. It's not on many organizations' radar. So there's a lot of subdomain takeovers left out there to be exploited. People don't even realize they're there. On top of that, it's very easy for an attacker to exploit a subdomain takeover in general. Some are trickier than others, but in general, it's relatively easy. It doesn't require a lot of technical skills. And you yourself, after seeing this presentation, should be enough to take a subdomain over if you wanted to. On top of that, exploitation is hard to detect. So what I mean by that is you might become a victim of subdomain takeover, but not realize it until much later. It's hard to detect that a subdomain takeover is actively being exploited. And then it can be chained with other minor security issues, misconfiguration issues, stuff like that. So in the end, a subdomain takeover can have a relatively high impact on your organization. So in order to protect yourself against subdomain takeover, you need to understand how it works and what kind of impact it can have on your organization. So to understand how it works, here's a typical scenario. Let's say that this company, Victim, wants to use a third-party service that we'll call TipTop. And TipTop says, okay, welcome to TipTop. You've created your account, blah, blah, blah. And here is your instance. It's available at this URL on our domain. But for Victim, that's not great, because what they'd like is to make their TipTop instance available from one of their own subdomains. So they go to TipTop and TipTop says, no problem, we offer this functionality. All you have to do is go to your DNS config and add a CNAME record, a DNS record of type CNAME that points one of your subdomains to your TipTop instance on our service. So Victim does that. They create a CNAME that points to victim.tiptopapp.com. And everything is great, but time passes, and after a while they realize, well, we don't really like TipTop anymore. Maybe it's too expensive, or maybe customer service isn't great. So they decide to cancel their subscription and destroy their instance. The problem is that after doing that, they forget to remove the CNAME record that points to TipTop. So they still have a dangling CNAME pointing to a TipTop instance that doesn't exist. And then, so yeah, the CNAME is left behind. And then an attacker appears and realizes exactly that victim.com has one of their subdomains pointing to a non-existing TipTop instance. And the attacker goes, okay, here's my opportunity. So the attacker, all the attacker has to do is recreate the missing instance, and from then on, he or she controls the content served by the subdomain of victim.com. Okay, so I'm simplifying a bit some of the subdomain takeovers. Some subdomain takeovers are more complicated than that. Some involve DNS records other than CNAMEs and stuff, but that should give you the gist of how subdomain takeovers happen. So what's the impact of a subdomain takeover? Well, it depends on mainly two things. First, what is the trust relationship that your base domain has with its subdomains? And second, what does the third-party service, so TipTop in my previous example, what does that service allow you to do? Is it platform as a service, or is it like a host for static pages like GitHub pages? Depending on how much power that third-party service gives you, the attacker will be able to do more or less stuff, and the impact will be different based on the nature of that third-party service. So there's many types of exploits that you can do with a subdomain takeover. I'll just give a few. First thing you can think of as an attacker is to deface the subdomain. So as an attacker, you might think, okay, I have total control over the content served by that subdomain. I'm just going to upload loads of pictures of cats, or I'm going to serve content that's meant to offend their users, so anything to harm the reputation of the target victim in my previous example. So that's what happened to Trump's campaign site in 2017. Sadly, it didn't prevent him from getting elected, but you can understand how embarrassing that can be for an organization. The second obvious exploit is phishing. A subdomain takeover is a fisher's wet dream, because what you do is you're surfing on the reputation of the root domain, xbox.com here. So imagine, as an attacker, if you could lure unsuspecting Xbox user to your subdomain, where you would serve, I don't know, a spoofed login form or a spoofed payments form, and your user or the visitors would go, oh, I'm on xbox.com or subdomain thereof. I'm safe. I can totally, I'm completely, I find this subdomain completely trustworthy. I want to connect to Xbox. I'm going to enter my credentials. And of course, when they click submit, the credentials or the sensitive data wouldn't be sent to servers that Microsoft controls, but it would be sent to the rogue server that's controlled by the attacker. Okay, so it's very insidious that way. At the same time, if the attacker controls all of the content served by that subdomain, nothing prevents him or her to obtain a TLS cert from somebody like Let's Encrypt or any CA, really. So on top of having control over the subdomain, they'd be able to serve it over HTTPS. And sadly, still a lot of people nowadays associate the presence of the lock in the address bar in the browser as a sign of trustworthiness of the site they're talking to, even though it's completely irrelevant, really. So for users of Xbox.com in this particular instance, it's very difficult to realize that they're talking to somebody malicious. It looks like they're talking to Xbox.com, and it looks like they're perfectly safe, but they're not. So that's why it's very tricky. Another possible exploit is malware distribution. I'm taking the example of a JavaScript file here, but it could be like an executable or something like that. So in this particular example, the attacker has noticed that static.victim.com is vulnerable to subdomain takeover, and he or she has taken control of that subdomain. And by looking at the logs, he or she realizes that the origin app.victim.com keeps requesting a JS file. Okay, so the attacker knows that if he or she serves that JavaScript file, it's going to get executed in the context of app.victim.com. So that could be interesting to like steal session cookies or stuff like that, something malicious anyway. So the attacker goes, okay, you're requesting a JS file. I'm going to serve a JS file to you, but it's going to be some JS file that I've concocted on purpose, that's going to do something malicious in the context of the app at victim.com. So that's horrible, right? That's like for victim, that's like having a persistent XSS vulnerability on app.victim.com. And then I mentioned that a subdomain takeover can be chained with other misconfiguration issues and stuff like that. So imagine if you have sensitive cookies scoped at victim.com. That means that if an attacker has taken control of one of your subdomains and manages to lure authenticated users to the subdomain in question, then he or she will be able to harvest sensitive cookies just by looking at the request log. If victim.com or app.victim.com has a CSP, a content security policy, that allows them to whitelist the source of JavaScript or the origins that can embed the site, then if the CSP is too lax and lists all the subdomains of victim.com in the whitelist, then they expose themselves potentially to XSS and clickjacking attacks. If victim.com has a CORS policy, but again, that CORS is too lax and allows all of their subdomains, then potentially an attacker could mount a CSRF attack in order to harvest sensitive data from users. And then if victim.com has some SSRF protection in place, so SSRF server-side request forgery, if they have protection in place but they allow any subdomain of victim.com, then a subdomain takeover on one of those subdomains will be enough to bypass that protection. So there's a lot of other exploits that I'm not mentioning here, but that should give you an idea. So now that you know what a subdomain takeover is, what should you do? Well, you understand how it works, so now you need to take that risk into account when you design your system. Maybe scoping all your sensitive cookies at the root of your domain isn't such a great idea, for example. Second, you should regularly audit your DNS records. Make sure that they don't gather dust. Make sure that you don't have dangling records pointing to stuff that can be taken over by a third or an attacker. And then, third point, when you're evaluating third-party solutions, hosting providers, cloud providers, have a look at what kind of protections they have in place against subdomain takeovers. Not all third-party services are equal in terms of protection against subdomain takeovers. For example, Azure is pretty bad. Google Cloud Platform and AWS are much better in terms of that kind of protection. Some services offer protections, others don't care at all. So when you're about to make a choice, I'm going to go with this provider or that provider, have a look at what kind of protection they have for subdomain takeovers. Okay, and if you'd like to know more, there's this post from 2014 from Detectify. It's kind of the post that popularized subdomain takeover. And then there's this blog by Patrick Hudak. He blogs a lot about subdomain takeover. It's well worth a read. And then third is this Git repo by Ed Overflow, where he documents the services that are vulnerable to subdomain takeovers. So it's far from exhaustive, but it gives you an idea of what kind of third-party service can get you in trouble if you use them. Okay, that's all for me. Bye.